Hey everybody, welcome back. As promised in my last video, I'm going to show the little question and answer video I did with my friend Janice Moskoff of Gather and Go Travel. And I'll link to Janice's YouTube channel and her website gatherandgotravel.com down in the description. Anyway, I think it's a little longer than I generally do. It's about a 20-minute question and answer video, but Janice is a wealth of information. And so if you are interested in travel in this modern era, having to deal with things like the pandemic and other things, she goes into trip insurance, which is something that I've never really thought about, but I think it's actually kind of important, especially now when you never know what might happen. That makes it impossible for you to follow through and go on a trip. Also, OM Systems, formerly Olympus, just announced the new OM1 Micro Four Thirds camera. And I've seen some initial reviews and thoughts, and they range from, oh my God, it's a revolution, to meh. And of course, the truth is going to be somewhere in between those two extremes. I think there is some interesting stuff that they've put in there as far as computational photography, which I've talked about in the past, which is what phones do. But I'll leave that for another video. And with that, we'll go to Janice. If you like this, please hit that like button. And any questions, comments, insights, leave them down below. And take it away, Janice. How did you get into travel writing and travel blogging?
Todd, it was something I've been thinking about doing for a really long time. For probably 10 years, I had talked about it. I had wanted to do it. And it really was a pandemic that had given me the chance to do it. Prior to the pandemic, I was the special events manager at our local Chamber of Commerce, running big public-facing events and doing volunteer management. And when the pandemic came, I had a lot of time on my hands. Everybody was social distancing, we weren't doing events. And it really gave me a chance to think about this dream, not necessarily to be trite, but it really was. It was something that I had thought about doing for 10 years. My background is deeply entwined in travel. It's something that I've been doing. And since the age of 9, I grew up in St. Louis, and my family took their first trip to the mountains. We didn't travel a lot when I was younger. I have 3 sisters, or there are 4 girls in the family, and it just really was too expensive. But every 4 or 5 years, we would take a trip, and when I was 9, we went to Colorado, and it was the first time I saw the mountains. And at that point, it blew my mind. I mean, the topography was so different than anything that I'd ever known, and it bit me. That was the travel bug people talk about. Is I wanted to see more of the world. I realized how much bigger the world was and how much more I wanted to see it. So at that point, I made travel a priority. I scrimped and saved throughout high school and college, and I made a lot of trips happen that were difficult to do. I did internships abroad, and I backpacked in Europe after college, and even volunteered to make it last longer. And once I met my husband, we traveled together, and even we both turned 30 when we did that years ago at this point. We did around the world backpacking trips. So I've been to over 40 countries. I've traveled throughout the United States. I'm a huge fan of national parks. I just love the exploration, the sense of discovery, and the learning that comes with travel. I've been deeply passionate about it, and the pandemic gave me a chance to really give it a shot. The most intimidating thing about being a travel writer and blogger was the actual writing. I'm an avid reader. I know good writing when I read it. And I was pretty sure that I wasn't going to be able to duplicate it. But here I am a year and a half later, and I've been practicing. And if practice doesn't necessarily make perfect, it gets me a whole lot better. I'm faster, I'm better, I'm able to communicate, the things that I deeply care about. And that's really how it came to be. The pandemic gave me that opportunity. I had the chance to work on something that was very intimidating to me, which was the writing. I learned to build a website, which wasn't the intimidating part, ironically, at all. And work in graphic design, improve my photography, my videography. I've learned a ton, and I launched the website just under a year ago.
Even though infections are on the wane, there is a lot of uncertainty about travel right now. How do you recommend would-be travelers approach trips and travel planning?
I think what I've learned, and I think a lot of the people I know have learned, is that, we all have a different level of risk tolerance. And I think when it comes to travelers, knowing what your risk level is and what you're comfortable with when you travel or when you contemplate travel is very important. Are you comfortable flying? Are you comfortable going out of the country and risking upon entry in order to get back into the United States? Every traveler needs to take to get a negative result on a COVID test, and if you end up with a positive result, you could have to quarantine. So there's a lot of risk these days in contemplating travel, whether or not it's going to happen, and what your comfort level is. So I think the first thing when it comes to travelers is really understanding where you are. And if you're feeling that you're risk averse, and maybe it's a local driving trip is something that is best for you to first test the waters. The other thing that I recommend for everybody, and this is something I was very bad about doing pre-pandemic, is buy trip insurance. I mean, this is an opportunity. This is probably the point where people's eyes glaze over, but I can't emphasize how important trip insurance is enough, is that you want to protect the trip when you book it and all of your prepaid expenses if you are not able to cancel for no penalty. And there's a lot of reasons to buy trip insurance. I even wrote an article. I think it's called Trip Insurance Simplified, the 4 reasons you need it. And then I talk about a few reasons in the instances when you don't. But even some of the most experienced travelers I know don't really understand trip insurance or buy it, or they just sort of chance it and they leave a lot at risk. So I think when contemplating travel is just understanding what your risk level is, understanding that travel may or may not happen. And then when you do decide to book, make sure that your investment in that trip is protected with purchasing trip insurance.
Given this uncertainty, what are tips for planning travel that might not even happen?
Well, as I mentioned, trip insurance for sure. If you've never bought it before, it's a couple extra $100. When you're contemplating your travel, you want to budget that into what your spend is, which also then transitions me to talk about budget. When you are planning travel, really understand what you're willing to spend, because if you have that idea of what you want to spend right off the bat, that will help you focus on where you want to go, what you want to do, how long that trip is, and then you can really save a lot of time travel planning. The other thing is that I think a lot of us are finding, me included, that I'm planning travel really far closer to the actual date of departure than I ever did in years past. We are going to New Orleans as a family during a school break, and I booked the trip maybe 2 weeks ago, and the trip is happening in less than 2 weeks. I think in most years past, pre-2020, I would have booked trips months in advance, anticipated them, been excited about them, but now it's just, it's kind of wait and see. Am I comfortable with having this trip happen? And I'm booking it closer to the actual date. So with that in mind, I think it's also important to have some tips on how do you plan this travel quickly. Is that, the trip's coming up so fast and you have to book your airfare, your hotel, your lodging, your activities. And my number one tip for people who are in that situation is go to Google Travel. Go ahead and search for it online. You'll find the Google Travel homepage. And Google has a suite of travel tools that are absolutely free and incredibly powerful. And I think under the radar, a lot of people don't know about them. And if you're not sure where to go and you have a trip and you have some dates coming up, the number one tool that I recommend using is Google Explore. And for users of Google Flights, they'll recognize Google Explorer because it's essentially a tool that sits on top of Google Flights, and it allows users who use Google Explorer to do an open-ended search from their origin city to any destination, not only in the United States but throughout the world, to see where they could go for either specific dates or for open-ended dates. For example, a week trip somewhere in the next 6 months. So it's a very powerful tool. So for example, I can put in the dates for a trip in April for a month from Chicago, my hometown, and just see where I can fly to, and I can pick the more affordable rates that meet my travel budget. Google Explorer also did something really cool in the last year, is they did an update to the tool that not only shows flights and destinations with airports, but flying and driving combinations. So it could be that you're going to a national park and Google Explorer will list that as one of your open-ended options from your origin city as a trip option. So it's incredibly powerful. I've discovered new places to go to. One year we were considering a spring break trip to Utah. Getting tickets to Salt Lake City, I used Google Explorer and saw tickets to Rome were only $50 more per person. And guess what? We planned the trip to Italy. Actually, it didn't happen. That was supposed to be spring of 2020, but we're trying to resurrect that this year. So it's a great option. In addition to Google Explorer, there's Google Hotels. I've done some YouTube videos about some of my favorite hidden buttons on Google Hotels that save me a lot of time. Plus, there's even Google Things to Do. And all of those will help find activities, hotels, lodging, everything that you need for a trip very quickly. So if you're in a situation, you're a few weeks out and you need to plan something, those will help. In addition, just Google searches. For the non-Pinterest users, Pinterest is a wonderful resource for things to do and activities for any destination that cuts through a lot of the paid advertising. And I find that's a really good way to get to what the travel bloggers and people who have actually been to those locations with very little to sell have some great ideas and recommendations and itineraries for the trip coming up.
Tell us about your recent travel. Where have you been and what has it been like traveling? Did all of your trips take place?
Yeah, all the trips took place, but yeah, that wasn't without a small amount of fretting and uncertainty. I think I've gone on a few trips, and I think even of the morning of the departure, I wasn't sure the trip would happen given airline cancellations and staffing shortages. And I think I've been approaching any of the trips that I've gone on recently with the uncertainty a day or two before. I wouldn't even talk about the trip that I was going on as a sure thing. I would say I hope it's going to happen. I'm not sure, but all of the trips have happened. Recently I went on a friend weekend in Palm Springs, California. It was my first time to Palm Springs, but not to the area. We did a day trip to Joshua Tree National Park, which I had been to before. And, that's exactly, it was at the beginning of January and the height of Omicron. And we really were uncertain if we should even go on the trip, but we hadn't bought a cancel for any reason insurance rider on our policies. And so the only way we could get out of the trip is if one of us actually got ill before and tested positive for COVID before we left. And thankfully, no one did. We went on the trip, and it was wonderful. It was wonderful to get out of the cold of the winter of Chicago into warm weather, eating outdoors. It's just a respite for, even though we were wearing masks, to be outside and to get away from everything and feel like life was still happening and going on, and it was a real vacation.
There's a lot of concern that travel and tourism have a negative effect on the environment. What is your opinion on this? And how can potential travelers minimize their environmental footprint?
That's a good question. It's something I have a personal internal conflict with, because obviously I love to travel, but I also love the outdoors. I love nature, and it's important for me personally to be a good steward of the environment. So I believe that the stat is about 8% of carbon emissions worldwide are related to travel and tourism, which is a huge amount. So it's undeniable that travel and tourism can have a negative net effect on the environment. So there are a few ways to combat this, but I think before I talk about some of the ways to do that, it's important to look at the bigger picture of what sustainability is, because the environmental aspect is so important, but there's two other components that are closely tied with those, especially in areas that are maybe a little bit more depressed or developing areas. And those have to do with positive economic growth and human well-being. And so those three components, the economic growth, the human well-being, and the environment stewardship are closely aligned, especially in areas where the people in a community make money from travel and tourism to care for their environment and bring travel and tourism there. So that's important to keep in mind, that this isn't a black or white issue. There are some shades of gray. And so for travelers like me who care, and others who are curious about what they can do to do more to reduce their emissions, there are a few things that you can do. One is that you can consider going to non-first tier locations. Some of the most popular destinations that are already heavily trafficked with tourists is consider going to maybe some second or third tier locations that are off the beaten track, and that will spread out the impact of travel and tourism. When you do travel, consider more of a slow travel mindset, that it's more localized. For example, for our spring trip to Italy, we're going to Europe for 10 days. And, instead of going from one major capital city to another, potentially over a 10-day trip, we could have gone to Rome and then Paris and then London. Instead of doing something like that, we're staying in 2 locations for the trip. We've considered even staying in one. And we'll be in Rome, and then we're spending half the trip, if it hopefully happens, in the Amalfi Coast. And we'll travel to the coast via train. And that's an important thing to keep in mind when you want to minimize your carbon footprint, is the transport that you plan to take. Air flights and cars have the biggest footprint. And one of the ways that you can minimize that is by taking trains and buses, public buses, when you can, and that will have a more positive effect on the environment. And if you do need to rent a car, consider looking for an electric one, and that's something that I think that we'd consider if we needed a car while we are there. Another thing that you can do is you can get on a carbon offset calculator. There's a free one, I believe. Cool Effect offers a carbon offset calculator, and you can calculate what you can pay and donate to certain causes, even through their calculator, to offset the travel that you're doing, and that's an option. Another thing that you can do is if you are considering group travel, is book your travel with a certified B Corporation who has to abide by a certification process to make sure that they're holding themselves to the highest standards of their employee well-being, their societal impact, and their environmental impact of their business. And so one of my favorite companies to travel with, I've been on a few group trips with them, is an Australian company called Intrepid Travel. They focus only on small group trips throughout the world. They are a certified B Corporation, and they make it a priority to stay at properties that are locally owned, to take local transport when they can, and to donate to causes that will help lift up the communities that they visit. And so those are a few things that you can do to really try to offset any impacts that may be negative when you travel.
Why do you believe people should travel?
You know what? I believe people should travel who want to travel. I do have some very good friends who actually don't like to travel at all. They're very much homebodies, and they like to stay home. And I would never, ever make an argument that those people should go out and go into the world and that will benefit them. But for the people who are curious and want to explore and want to get out there, one of the things that I think would benefit them are some of the things that have benefited me, which, for me, travel gets me into a position that makes me uncomfortable, which on the face of it sounds negative, but it's not. Because when I'm uncomfortable in a new place or a new language or new foods or trying some activity that feels a little dangerous or a little adventurous for me, is I know I'm learning. I'm uncomfortable and I'm learning. I'm learning new things, either about myself or about the place I'm visiting, which then transitions me into another reason that I love travel, is that I personally love to learn so much. I love to learn more about the culture, the history, the people, and the place that I'm visiting. And if it's their art or their food, one of my favorite things about travel is trying new foods and getting exposed to new ways of cooking. I love to cook at home, and travel is a great way to be introduced to new spices and new techniques, and I incorporate that a lot. And, travel is, it gives you a chance to see beautiful things throughout the world and be in awe of what nature has created, and, just be surprised. It takes you out of your home environment, and it takes me out of my community and reminds me that there is so much bigger world out there. And that helps give me a very realistic perspective of where I am in the world and how much bigger it is. And it reminds me also that once I'm out there, I'm able to shed a little bit of the negative impact that the news and the media has about the world being a scary place, because a lot of times it's not. There's good people out there that want the same things that my family does, that I want out of life, and my family does. And that doesn't make the news. There's a lot of good people out there, and I'm not trying to be too Pollyanna-ish, but it's really, there's a lot to discover that maybe doesn't come across, on in the internet or the news. And I think travel helps cut through that noise, and it brings people a lot of opportunity and perspective and growth. And those are just a few of the reasons that I love to travel, and I think would help other people who are interested in it as well.
Okay. Thank you, Janice. I really appreciate it. I think our viewers will be just very interested in what you've told them.
Thank you, Todd, so much. This is a great opportunity. I appreciate it so much. Thank you for having me on your program and on your channel too. It's a great honor. I really appreciate it.